Hello, darlings. Hello, sweetmeats. Hello, delicious little morsels. Hello, great giants. Hello, great hearts. Hello, dry people. Hello, big bouncy people. Hello to all of you, and welcome to Mooney's Mythic podcast. And this podcast is sponsored by water. Oh, yes. Every single drop of water that has ever entered your system, that is ever coming out of your system, that has fallen from the sky, that has risen up from the earth, that has waved across our beaches, every single drop of water wants us to thrive. And in that way, this podcast is sponsored by water. This podcast is sponsored by the water that we drink, the water that we take into our bodies, that cleanses and cleans us, that floods our cells. This podcast is sponsored by the water that we wash and we clean and we clear ourselves in. And I wonder where you are right now. And I wonder where the source of water, where the closest source of water is. Where did the ancestors of the land that you are standing on, where did they go and gather water? Have you been to that place? Have you looked at an old map and seen where the springs are? And here I am in Glastonbury, and I'm thinking of the White Spring, and I'm thinking of the Red Spring, and I'm thinking of Dalting Spring and a couple of other springs around me. And as I'm imagining them, with the water dripping down through the earth and coming up out of the earth, I'm thinking about my own fertility and my own flow. And I'm remembering about the story that I told in the last episode about the sister of the swans. And as soon as I finished the podcast, or that night after I'd finished the podcast, I had a dream. And I dreamed of this stretch of water. And it's a stretch of water that's familiar to me because it's where I grew up. It's the Slapton Lee. And the swans, the Swan brothers, they were all on the water and they were slowly transforming. And some of them were kind of looking like beautiful swans on the water, but then I could see under the water and I could see their feet moving furiously. And I was thinking about transformation, about the times in my life when I've changed patterns or changed things in my life, and sometimes things just change really quickly, like snap. You're just in another realm, or you make a decision you don't want to do something anymore. But more often than not, for me, transformations have been cyclical. They've taken 7 years. Lots of changes in my life have taken 7 years. So I was thinking about this 7-year journey of the woman in the story and thinking about what we need to gather when we know we want to make a big change in our life that's going to take time. And I was thinking about what she was gathering. And so she gathered the herbs. So what do we need to sustain us? What herbs, what medicines, what gifts from nature can we use to support us if we want to do things differently? And she picks them by the moon. So there's trust in something, kind of going into the dark places, into the instinctive places to allow ourselves to be guided. And then there's this moon, sun, rising, falling, dawn, dusk. These movements of the of light and of the planets around us, they can give us rhythm. They can give us a rhythm that means we can follow our own internal patterns, and we're not looking for patterns on the outside, the kind of clock watching and week watching. We can go into our own timeline, our own time source, so that we can really grow and become ourselves. And I was thinking about her slow making of the tunics. And it got me thinking about the winter, about autumn, and yeah, it's like we're approaching the solstice, the summer solstice, but there's a part of me that's already gathering stories and gathering kind of dreaming materials and crafting materials for the winter. Already sort of feeling the thrill that when the summer is ended, we will be going into these warm times, these cozy times by fires. Because of course that is the natural habitat of a storyteller. And I've been doing quite a bit of storytelling this week. And on Friday night was the famous, I know I've talked about it a few times on this podcast, but it was the actual date of the Hedgehog gig. And that was really exciting. So how this came about was that my friend Sarah Curtis, who's amazing singer, touches me in places that have felt unreachable. We'd done a gorgeous gig for winter solstice last year, and I hope we do more this year. And she'd asked me if I would do a story about a hedgehog, and I was feeling uncertain because I always feel a bit, this time of year always just feels a bit like scattered, especially in Glastonbury when everyone's getting ready for the festival, but also because it's the solstice and it's like there's just so much energy moving. So I was a bit uncertain, and I said, oh, I don't know any stories about hedgehogs, and she sent me one, and it was really good, and I was like, oh, you've got me. So I did. I said yes. And so it came about on Friday that we did this gig with another musician called Paul Thompson, and also a violin player called Ishtara. Thank you so much, both of you. You brought so much. And the second most exciting thing for me about this night was that in the morning, my podcast stickers had arrived. Now, these are just kind of like teacup-sized stickers, and they have on them Mooney's Mythic podcast, and they've got a QR code, like a maze. And apparently, I don't have a smartphone, but apparently if you take a picture of that, it'll take you straight through the portals of life and light to the podcast. And I was being very excited about these stickers, and so finally they arrived, and they look just as good as I wanted them to. Thank you, Jaya, for designing them. And you just would not know how many people have told me where to stick them. Everyone's got an idea about just where I can stick these stickers, and I really thank you for all your advice and all your suggestions. Thank you very much. And that's what I just want to open it out to all you great listeners. If there's any of you that have got some ideas about where to stick these stickers, do let me know. And if you want me to post you a bundle, then I will post you a bundle and you can stick them where you like. I'd really, really appreciate that. And even the first couple of people that get in touch with me, I will send you one of Sarah Curtis's amazing hedgehog cards. She's made some hedgehog Glastonbury cards, and I'll send them along with the stickers. And the first favourite thing about that night was that Sarah Curtis sang her new song, which was called The Hedgehog Queen of Glastonbury, and it was just like, for me, an instant classic, like narrative poem, beautiful song, just totally amazing and delicious and delightful, and I adored it. I just absolutely adored it. So I broke my agreement to myself that I would give myself until October to have a guest on to sort of get used to all the nobbles and bobbles and twiddles and whittles. And I have invited Sarah Curtis onto this podcast today, and we are sitting on a sofa, and I know you can't hear her, but she's here, and she's going to sing The Hedgehog Queen of Glastonbury. Now, this program that I'm using, because I'm not very technical, you basically just press play and there's no way of editing. So how we're going to do it is she's here, she's going to be very quiet, and then maybe she'll like crawl out of the room on her hands and knees, or sort of slide out like a worm, or I'm not sure how. We should have maybe practiced it. But anyway, if you hear any clunking or glunking, then it's Sarah leaving, or dropping something on her way out. But without further ado, hello, Sarah.
Hello, Sarah.
Brilliant. Thank you for being my first ever guest on Mooney's Mythic podcast. It's exciting to have you.
I feel great. Thank you. Thank you. Honoured to be your first guest.
Oh, well, yeah. Would you like to say anything before you sing?
Gosh, well, it's quite a new song, The Hedgehog Queen, and she goes on a little journey around Glastonbury, yeah, I guess.
Well, let's go on a little journey around Glastonbury with you.
Okay. In the land of Glastonbury, where meadows bloom so far, there lived the eldest hedgehog queen. Her crown shone like the stars. She roamed the fields at twilight with her crown so fair and bright, and sang to all the creatures underneath the pale moonlight. Oh, hedgehog queen of Glastonbury, you dance among the flowers, you roam about this peaceful land, sing for hours and hours. Your heart is pure and gentle, your spirit wild and free. Oh, hedgehog queen. She shuffled up to Weariel Hill, where once a tree did stand. The holy thorn of Glastonbury echoed out the land. And then one night some wicked men, they killed and chopped it down. The hedgehog queen was so upset, it almost broke her crown. Oh, hedgehog queen of Glastonbury, you dance among the flowers, you roam about this peaceful land, sing for hours and hours. Your heart is pure and gentle, your spirit wild and free. Oh, hedgehog queen. Many years before, she heard King Henry took his reign and ordered for the abbey to go up in fire and flame. She told the other hedgehogs there to move to somewhere safe. The abbey stands in mystery, even to this day, this day. Went up to the door, the moon was full and bright. She meets the friendly dragon, then he flies into the night. And then to chat as well she goes, and sips from red to white, healing all her broken spines, giving her such light. Oh, hedgehog queen of Glastonbury, you dance among the flowers, you roam about this peaceful land, sing for hours and hours. Your heart is pure and gentle, your spirit wild and free. Oh, hedgehog queen. King Arthur and sweet Guinevere, the knights at the round table, met with the hedgehog queen and all her subjects who were able. She spoke of where to hide an ancient goblet with such powers. Eternal life was granted for the hedgehogs and the flowers. walking through the lanes at night. Remember of the Hedgehog Queen, a crown of stars so bright. And maybe she will tell you of adventures and of tales, or even where the hedgehog hid the secret Holy Grail. Oh, Hedgehog Queen of Glastonbury, you dance among the trees, you roam about this peaceful land, sing the songs you please. Your heart is pure and gentle, your spirit wild and free. Oh, Hedgehog Queen, for all eternity, eternity, eternity. Oh, Hedgehog Queen, for all eternity, eternity.
Cool. Cool, thanks.
You're welcome. Hope you enjoyed it.
Thanks. Wow. Can I ask you a couple of questions?
Yeah, sure.
You can make this sign like kind of like a knife going across your neck if you just want me to stop. Okay? Yeah.
All right. Yeah.
So, how do you feel when you're singing?
I feel like I'm flying really with the Hedgehog Queen, or whatever I'm singing. It's really nice to just kind of be in harmony with yourself, and you're just singing and flying off with the sound.
Mm. And
Yeah.
when you wrote that song, what was the feeling or purpose or?
Well, we had the Hedgehog gig coming up, and and Paul Thompson, the other singer-songwriter, he wrote a song called The Baby Hedgehog, and so I thought it only apt that I try and make something up about a hedgehog, and just thought it'd be really good to have a hedgehog queen, and to go around Glastonbury and put a bit of truth into the songs. There's one bit, about the tree getting chopped down, which is true, because there is a tree on Wiriel Hill which is very special and is meant to be the staff of Joseph of Arimathea.
When, they put a stick of it in the wreath at Christmas at Buckingham Palace.
Do
you know
they?
That? Yeah.
Wow.
They did before it was chopped down.
Oh wow, okay. That's amazing. Yeah. So it's just so sad that some vandals went and just chopped it all down for some reason. I mean, for what reason? Just out of boredom and spite and nastiness. So, yeah, it was nice to put that in, the justice, well, not justice, but how the hedgehogs feel about that, and
well, it's good to not suppress when things happen for whatever reason, because we don't know who did it or why they did it, but it's just good to kind of healing comes from bringing things up and out, doesn't it? I've been thinking a bit about that recently. Well, I think it's a classic. It touched me in lots of different ways, and and it just kind of builds and builds in my heart as you sing. So thank you for thanks for bringing it, thanks for singing it, and I just hope that you get lots of different opportunities. I hope that you sing it at the Abbey, and I hope you sing it at Wiriel Hill. I hope you sing it at Buckingham Palace. I hope lots of people get to hear it, because it's a gorgeous song. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I know Sarah because I have known her since before the days of the choir, but we are in a choir together, the Avalonian Free State Choir. I mean, one day maybe my living room can be filled with everyone from the choir and we could have a sing on the podcast. But I was just thinking about the last choir rehearsal that we had, because I was really hungry. It's always like that for me. It's like 1 o'clock choir start, 1:15, and I've usually had a busy morning, and I'm rushing to choir, and I'm thinking, oh, I'm going to be really hungry in choir, and then it's hard for me to concentrate. So I went to the Chippy, um, which is just around the corner from when we rehearsed. So I went to the Chippy, and I went in the Chippy, and a guy had a kind of tin hat on, um, and that's how I knew it was D-Day. Now I think about D-Day more than you might think, that a person thinks about D-Day, for a few reasons. But when I saw him there behind the Chippy with his tin hat on, I immediately thought about my grandparents, about my two granddads, who they were both in the war, Second World War. And I was thinking about the look that they had that was similar in their faces. And the word I came up with, that my mind threw up, was haunted. They had this haunted look in their faces, and they never really, talked about the war. People didn't talk about the war. And then unbidden, I got this random memory come up that my granddad, Goo, we used to call him Granddad Goo, he was looking after me one day. I was about 5. He lived in West Ham. He played football for West Ham United. And anyway, he was looking after me once, and I was about 5, and he took me to the betting shop, and he had this little dog, Jack Russell, and he asked me to hold on to the dog whilst he put a bet on. I think he must have watched the race, because I was outside the betting shop for ages. He told me not to speak to anyone, and people kept coming up and talking to me, because obviously quite unusual to see a 5-year-old standing, or maybe it wasn't at that time, standing outside the betting shop with a dog. But people were like, "Hello, are you with someone? Are you with some?" And I just followed the rules, and he said don't speak to anyone, so I was just not speaking to anyone. So I didn't speak to anyone anyway. He finally came out. And my other memory of that day was that he bought this cake. He bought like a big Victoria sponge cake, and he gave me a slice, and then he ate the rest of it. Anyway, when I told my mum about this day, I never went to, he never looked after me again, which I thought was a sort of mixed blessing, because it was interesting on some level, but maybe not that safe. So then I had the thoughts of D-Day in my mind, which took me home. And when I say home, I mean to Slapton Sands, which is where I spent a lot of my childhood. We moved there. Well, actually, we lived in a village about 2 miles from the beach. And when you're young and you don't, your only way of getting around is bus and walking, 2 miles can be quite it's a half an hour walk. Yeah, so I never really appreciated until I moved away how close to the beach we actually lived, because I felt like we lived really inland. And my friend Gail, who grew up on the beach, she's got like hair the colour of sand and eyes the colour of the sea, and I just thought that's how people looked when they grew up by the sea. And I I was born in the city, and then moved there, and that that's why I didn't have that look. It was amazing that I should be thinking about Gail, because I then bumped into her at the Scythe Fair, which was the next place that I did some storytelling at. So I was set to go to the Scythe Fair on Sunday morning to do some storytelling, and I started thinking about scythes. And my grandmother, she died about 5 years ago, and when I was in hospital, there was I went to the canteen, and I just saw this flash of this figure, all black, holding a scythe. I know it sounds crazy, but I did. I hadn't had a lot of sleep. For whatever reason, I saw that image. So I started pondering on this image of the scythe, and this image of the scythe as death. And Wikipedia will tell you that it comes from medieval times, that it comes from the times of the Black Death. But I remember the story of Uranus and Gaia. There's this story, this Greek myth. It's from, it must be from like 700 BC, Hesiod. And Gaia gives birth to Uranus, and he kind of wraps around her. He's like the night sky, and he wraps around her, and he loves being in power, and he won't let the children have any power. They give birth to giants and titans, the 12 titans, and Gaia wants him gone. She wants him out of the way. It's like he's wrapped all around her and he's holding all the power, and none of the children want to kill him, but it's Kronos. He's the youngest, and she makes this steel scythe for him, and he slashes it through the night sky, and Kronos goes here, there and everywhere. His genitalia, I just love that word. I was going to say, I think it's his testicles, but I just love the word genitalia. It kind of, I don't know, for me it's got the same sort of thrill as bunting. The word bunting, it's like festive. There's something festive about the word genitalia. Anyway, I must try and stay on some kind of track. Yes, out of the foam of his genitalia, Aphrodite's born, but Kronos becomes king. And Kronos, because he's done this action of killing his father, and there's some prophecy about his children overthrowing him, he's completely freaked out, and so he eats all of his children. He just, he's doing the same thing. It's the ancestral pattern carrying on of suppressing the young life. And then the mother tricks him by giving him a stone to eat, pretending that it's Zeus. I think he says, feed the baby one more time. And she feeds it, and the milk spurts because it's a stone. It's not absorbing any milk. And that spurt is supposed to have become the Milky Way. You see, the gods, the Greeks were at it. They segued in their stories here, there and everywhere. But Zeus was brought up by nymphs, and then Zeus and Poseidon and Hades, they overthrew Kronos in the end, and that's how we get that pantheon of gods, Demeter and Poseidon, Hades and blah, and all those guys. So I was thinking about that image of the scythe as I was going to the scythe fair, and I was thinking about tithe barns, because around here in Glastonbury there's quite a few tithe barns that are attached to the abbey. So it's where supposedly the 10% of your harvest would go, so that the abbey or the kings or whoever would kind of take it off you as your sort of physical taxes. And whenever I've been in a tithe barn, I felt touched by how holy they are. They seem to have this golden, sacred beauty about them. I really feel that. And so I started thinking, well, maybe it's where we still worship the grain and worship the corn and worship the harvest and gave thanks and gave libation and sang the old songs and sang the things that we weren't allowed to do or say when the church got involved with everything. Maybe there were the meeting places. It's a huge taking, this harvest, this scything down. When I was watching it at the scythe fair, just lopping a whole, mono harvest from the land. And it wouldn't have been long that we'd been doing that, that we sort of just grew one crop and then raised it down and took it for ourselves. So I would imagine there was some careful ritual and rite of passage around this that helped us to stay in connection with the balance of the earth. So, I was thinking about tithe barns, and I was thinking about the scythe fair. I was thinking about all those things, and then who should I bump into at the scythe fair? But my school friend Gail, and she was with the brothers John and Freddie and their mum Di, And these were 3 people that I went on the school bus with, and it was just so nice and fine to see them at this beautiful place, at this fair which celebrates the traditional, lots of traditional crafts there. I was storytelling in the morning, and then straight after my storytelling there was some gorgeous singers singing about trees. Very beautiful. They're blacksmiths there, and woodworkers, and yeah, special place. So for a moment it was like walking back in time, walking through all these traditional craftsmen, and then they were Gail and John and Fred and their mum Di. And then that got me back round to thinking about D-Day, because where I was born, or where I grew up on Slapton Sands, is where the D-Day practices were allegedly held. The whole village was evacuated, and all the Americans moved in, and there were great D-Day practices, and there are all these stories that I grew up with about that there were hundreds and hundreds of coffins that were made, and that there was a mass grave built, and that everything went wrong, that there was friendly fire. And I say that in inverted commas because I wasn't sure what that meant, but it basically means when people mistakenly open on their own side and kill everyone. So there was this practice that was maybe did or maybe didn't go wrong. It's all been very much covered up. And then this guy and his friend come down to Torcross to go on holiday. Ken Small and his mate. And Ken Small becomes really interested. He hears that there's a tank that has been sunk off the coast of Torcross, and he goes on through this great. And he's a hairdresser. He was a policeman. He was a hairdresser. He, real individual character. And he found out who owned that tank, even though it was sunk in the water. And he paid some American company $50 for it, and even though that tank was still in the sea, he now owned it, and he spent 10 years getting it up out of the sea, and it's now in the car park, Slapton Sands. And this was about the time when I was moving down there that it got it out, and he would be by the tank quite a lot, with his boot of his car open, and he'd written this book called The Forgotten Dead, about these people, about this Operation Tiger, about the D-Day practices that had gone wrong. I have not read this book because he was an adult. Yeah, I was like 9 or 10, and he was an adult. And I was just going through that phase where all adults were just, I just had an absolute allergy to. But I'm going to read that book. I'm going to see what it's got to say. And I remember that image of him all in black with a bit of gold round his neck, standing by his car selling his books. And I just thought, oh God, what a weirdo. And now I think wow, how much courage. Sometimes I find it hard to get a book out or a CD at the end of a gig and say, oh, I've got this to sell or whatever. But to stand there and just like be willing to talk to strangers about the story that you've uncovered, about a truth that you've uncovered, I think took a lot of courage. And also that all this material was covered up, and that he was bringing to the surface all this suppressed material. And I think that's just so important in life. And that's what, bringing me back to the Kronos story. It's like they're trying to push things down and push things down and push things down. It never works, it has to come up and out and be honoured and acknowledged, and that's how things can move, I believe. And our children, they kind of embody their sort of freedom in movement, aren't they, children? And that can be difficult for us adults, or definitely for me as a mum. There are places where I had to kind of grow in some places that were tight, so that I could allow my son to grow as well. So I bump into Gail at the Scythe Fair, and Gail is this guy Ken Smalls. Her dad is his mate. And actually Gail's mum used to run one of Ken Small's hairdressers. That's how they started going down to Torcross in the first place. And they were in the pub, the local pub to start being, with Ken Small, and they spoke to the owners saying, if you ever want to give up the lease on this pub, we'd love to take it on. And so they did eventually, and they had an interview with the brewers. And by then, Gail's mum was pregnant with Gail. She didn't want to say anything. She really wanted the pub. And it all went through very quickly. And then a great storm brewed. This great storm brewed. And it was huge. There were like snowdrifts, and it wreaked havoc on the village and the villages all along the beach. Gail's dad was sandbagging the road all night long, and just fell asleep the next day when Gail's mum was ringing to say that she was going to have a baby, that she got into labour, and so he missed the labour. Anyway, they just about got Gail's mum to Torbay Hospital, going down the back roads, and Gail was born, except she wasn't called Gail then. She was called Kirsty May. And the butcher, Hannaford, said, you can't call her Kirsty May. Not on a night like this, not to be born on a night like this, you can't call her Kirsty May. And that is why she's called Gail. So yeah, I bumped into Gail at the Scythe Fair. And what's really exciting for me is that she's been listening to the podcast. Thanks for listening, Gail. And I really thank everyone who has said to me, thanks for doing the podcast. And yesterday I was feeling a bit nervous. I don't know how I could be feeling nervous, because I knew that Sarah Curtis was going to come and sing. And that's the great thing about working with musicians or working with other people. You can always think, oh, anyway, what I do is terrible. They're going to bring it home. So I needn't have been nervous, but I was feeling nervous. And then I saw my friend Sophia, and she was like, I'm loving the podcasts. And then I got a message from my friend Siska spreading the podcast joy. So just wanting to shout out to those two people to say thank you so much for just letting me know how you're feeling about the podcast. So I've been doing some research on podcasts, okay, because as you know, I love Blind Boy, and he talks about hot takes, okay. And I was thinking, I didn't know this lingo. What even is a hot take? So I've looked it up. Okay, a hot take. A hot take is a piece of deliberately provocative commentary that is based almost entirely on shallow moralising in response to a news story, usually written on tight deadlines with little research or reporting and even less thought. I mean, that is right up my street. That has given me the confidence to carry on. I've got to say, like, absolutely gives me, because I just think I don't know enough about something, or I haven't thought deeply enough about anything. But this notion of the hot take just gives me absolute permission to just keep going. So thank you for that. And it also means that I can kind of cast about for different things to talk about. But right now we're at the Scythe Fair, and I'm going to read to you this poem by Lorraine Pickles, because it reminded me of being at the Scythe Fair. It's called Clarissa the Corn Maiden. Clarissa the Corn Maiden set off on her holidays on the Eurostar to France. She wanted to experience different ways of being. She liked the way the gathered corn was wound round and round in spirals, like an endless dance. This was how she wanted to live. She danced in the warm summer sun to the song of the cicadas, accordions and Edith Piaf records being played on wind-up gramophones, and she would lie down looking at the endless sky, drowsed by the scent of lavender, soothed by the poppies and sunflowers, until it grew dark and the sky was full of stars. One night there stood in the moonlight a deer with soft eyes who beckoned Clarissa to follow her, past all the wayside shrines, up to the miller's house. Clarissa was wary. She heard millers tended to grind you down. She had a fear of becoming something different, of losing the essence of herself. The miller had a jaunty air and eyed her up hopefully. He was enchanted by her long golden hair and perfect ears, and he would watch her every morning from his window, dancing, always dancing. He had gathered so many like her, ripened by the summer sun, but this one was different. He wanted to keep her to himself, to sit beside the fire with her on long winter evenings, to hold her in his arms and to read her the writings of French existentialist philosophers. He prayed to the Great Mother that he would be saved from himself and that things would not end the way they normally did. Clarissa was unaware of the miller's struggle. She was just enjoying her ripening, and besides, she had a return ticket home. On the last day of her holiday, the miller gathered her up, and with a tear in his eye, put her back on the train. Thus Clarissa escaped certain death, and the miller escaped inevitability. Broken-hearted, he gave up being a miller, and instead became a poet, and wrote endless poems about Clarissa, the lost corn maiden. He would give poetry readings in Paris cafes. Eventually he became professor of poetry at the Sorbonne, but sometimes, on warm summer days, he would see his corn maiden dancing out of the corner of his eye, and he would say to himself, "If there was one good thing that I have done with my life, it was to let her go." It's gorgeous, isn't it? That's a Lammas poem, a harvest poem by Lorraine Pickles. And it really brings me into the golden light, to the to the tiny, let's just visualize now, tiny little bit of corn and how it grows towards the sun, strong and tall and high, and then there's like this 100 pieces of corn can fruit from it. And may that be our journey towards the light and this harvest time at this solstice, that those little kernels within us, they begin to grow and strengthen and give off. And they're the children, aren't they? Those bits of corn that are the abundance of corn that arrives, they're the children of the corn. Oh, I think that's a horror film, isn't it? But they are the children of the corn. And so we need to go beyond these stories of cutting down the children and suppressing the children, but just to let them up and open and out. I wonder if any of you are wondering, what was the story that I told on that Friday night when it was all about the hedgehog? I wonder if any of you are wondering about that. Because the story is arriving in my lap as I am watching the men with their shirts off scything at the fair. The story is arriving in my lap as I hear the harmony singing smoothly echoing around me. The story is arriving in my lap as I think of ice creams in the summer sun. Because I think that's where they met, you know, this couple. I think they met at the scythe fair. I think they had a roll in the hay. And they were in love. A lasting love, you know. They tucked down by the fire in the autumn. They went through a quiet winter together. And in the spring, it was decided that they were going to stay together. And they would want for nothing. Well, that's not exactly true, because she did want something. She wanted a baby. She really, really wanted a baby. I mean, it might have just been her hormones, because it can be a little bit like that. But she was so desirous to have a child, and to have a child with him. And it wasn't coming. You know, month after month, she found that she wasn't pregnant. And so she started to do what he thought were very odd things. She started to take her temperature. She started to demand sex at the moment, right in the very moment. And it quite put him off his stride, you know. He liked to take things a bit more relaxed than that. She started to eat certain things, and sometimes in bed he would find crystals, and sometimes the windows, the curtains were open so that the moon could pour in, and sometimes the fire was lit and there were funny smells on the fire, and on and on and on it went. Until one day he rolled over to give her a cuddle in bed, and he found her feet. And he was like, "What are you doing? What are you sleeping down there for?" And she said, "Oh, the midwife said if I just slept like this just for one night, and then turned around widdershins 3 times, and then touched the ground and put the spit of a deer behind my ears." He said, enough, I've had enough of this. Come on, this is ridiculous. And she said, "I want a baby." And the window was open. And the moon was shining on her face. "I wants a baby," she said. "I wants a baby so much, I shouldn't even care what it was like," she said. "I want to gather it up. I want to hold it. I want to feed it. I wants a baby. I wants a baby, and I wouldn't even care if it was like a hedgehog." There was a wind that heard her, the wind of change. There was a wind that was listening to what she wanted. And she found very soon that she was pregnant. And she was delighted. She was so happy. She walked about with that great bump, and people admired it. And she said, "Oh yes, look at me, I'm having a baby. I'm having a baby." And when the baby came, even though it was furry and snout-nosed, she didn't care. She loved it. She had her baby that she could snoodle up, that she could cuddle, that she could love. She didn't care. Some people did care. Some people noticed. They noticed that, was it fur or were they prickles? That little snouty nose, was it? Some people said that she'd given birth to a hedgehog, and they laughed at her. Not in front of her, you see, but they would laugh behind her back. They would laugh at how she caught it up and cuddled it, and how she fed it on her breast. "It's a hedgehog," they said. "It's a hedgehog." But they nodded and didn't say anything when the couple went past. But he knew. He knew they were laughing at him, and he couldn't stand the way his child looked, and you should have seen the way it ate like a hog at the table, and the spikes that seemed to be getting longer and darker every day. And then, when he would go to the pub, he'd get the jokes and the ribbing, and they would say, "All right," he said, "don't be prickly," they'd say, or "you look like you've got a bit spiky lately." "Oh, oh, 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 oh." "Oh, don't," they said, we're only joking. And he would be eaten up inside with rage, until one night he'd had enough, and he went home, and he threw his hedgehog son out. And his hedgehog son said, okay, you make me a saddle for the rooster, and me and the rooster and a couple of other animals will be gone, and I'll never see you again. And why, you didn't need to ask that man twice. He made and crafted the most beautiful saddle for the rooster, and he gave it to his son, and he said nothing about the mother's weeping. And Hans, because that was his name, he went up to his mum and he hugged her. And then he dared to go up to his dad and he hugged him. And that was the moment when his dad realised how soft he was, how soft his prickles were. And that was the moment when a tiny pencil line cracked in the mother's heart. And each day it grew bigger and bigger and bigger until it finally broke apart completely and she died. But Hans was long gone by this time. He rode his rooster far, far, far away until so much time had passed. Cycles and cycles and moons and suns. 20 years had passed. And he lived quietly. And he lived in a very remote place. And he hardly ever saw anybody until one day a king was lost in the woods. So lost. And he found himself at a door. And he knocked on that door. And he tried not to look afraid when a kind of a man answered. A kind of a man with spikes on his back and a snouty little nose. And he said, will you help me find my way home? Come in, Hans said. And he set food by the fire. And the king ate it. And then Hans, he began to sing a low, slow drone. And the king was so weary, and he was so grateful to be by a crackling fire, that he took the invitation of those long, low notes, and he flew with them, and what dreams he had. Dreams, well, it was the kind of thing you could only ever dream of. And then when he awoke, he found that he wasn't in the hedgeman's home. He was close to his castle. So close he could find his way back easily. And he saw the hedgehog man in the distance, and he said, thank you so much. What can I give you? And Hans shook his head. And he said, please, let me give you something. And he said, okay, he said, give me the first thing that you see when you get home. Okay, said the king, quite enjoying the thought of that, the game of that, and also a little sad because he thought that maybe it would be his trusty dog. But perhaps that would be a fine gift anyway. And so he continued on his way. And as he continued on his way, the dog was not the first to approach him. Maybe he was frightened off by the scent of hedgehog around him. But it was his daughter that came, and she wrapped her arms around him, and she hugged him tight, and he swung her around. And as he swung her around, he saw the hedgehog man, Hans's eyes, looking at him. A year and a day, he said, and the voice was carried on the wind. A year and a day, and I'll come back for my prize. And so the king went back to the castle with his daughter, and that time passed. And then the Queen said, "Why don't we have a party? Why don't we have a party? It's been nearly a year since you were lost in the woods and we thought you were dead and gone forever. Why don't we have a party?" So they did. They had a great party and they had bunting all around and cakes with whipped cream and raspberries on top. And they had jugglers and fire eaters, and they had a tarot reader, the best tarot reader in the land, and he said, "May I read your tarot to the king?" And the king agreed, and the first picture was a king, and oh yes, the king said, "Definitely, that looks like me, strong and gorgeous." And the second one was a queen, and what a beautiful queen she was. And next to her was a princess, and the queen and the princess were on this card, and they all looked and they laughed at their images in such beauty. And the third card was a hedgehog. The king smashed up the table and he said, "Get away, what is this, get away." And then, in the shadow of the doorway of the castle, he saw Hans himself. Now the princess knew about this promise. So when Hans asked her, "Do you know who I am?" she said, "Yes." "And do you know why I'm here?" "You're here to marry me." "And do you think I am hideous?" "Not as hideous as going back on a promise," she said, and she held her head high. And there was no joy in the ceremony. It was sombre and still, and although the bunting was still up and the balloons were still blown, they all seemed smaller and to have less colour and less bounce than the night before. But the dread of the princess was mounting and mounting as evening grew near. And she went to the bedchamber and she lay in bed and she screwed her eyes closed and pretended to be asleep, and there was a tiny feather-like kiss on her cheek, and that was all. And she dared, after a while, after she could feel the shadow of the hedgehog was not over her, she dared to open her eyes, and she saw something extraordinary, my friends. She saw this hedgehog man. She saw him stretch and yawn by the fire that night and become a man. It was as if he shucked off his hedgehog quills and they lay by the fire. And she saw him go out of the window and tend to the animals outside. And she saw by the light of the moon that he was beautiful. And she dared to creep out of the bed and she lay down on his hedgehog prickles, and they were soft and they were warm, and she could hear him, so she ran back into the bed and she pretended she'd seen nothing. But the next night she waited. She wasn't so afraid when his dark shadow loomed over her. And she almost opened her eyes when she felt the kiss on her cheek. And she waited. And she saw him transform again, and she saw him go out of the window, and she went and she laid by the fire, and it was as though his prickles were softer than the night before, thicker, and the scent was heady musk that made her swoon. And she fell asleep there by the fire, and that's where she was when he returned, and she woke with a start, and she said, "Oh, I'm so sorry," and she kept on talking, because that's what she did when she was nervous. And he said, "I'm enchanted. I'm under a spell. And if you say nothing of it, and if you do nothing for one more night, for 3 nights, and that spell will be broken, and then we'll see." And she promised, of course, that she would say nothing of it, and she would do nothing about it, and then we would see. And the next morning she bounced down to the breakfast table, and she ate like she hadn't eaten for days. And when her mother asked if she was okay, she said, "I'm fine, I'm totally fine, everything's great." And the mother said, "We have been to see the wise witch in the woods. We have been to see her, and you know, he's not a hedgehog man. He's under a spell." "I know," said the girl. "You know?" "Oh, no, I didn't mean to say that." She said, "No, I mean, I suppose I assumed." She said, "Well, she says that there is a way to break the spell, that at night he removes his prickles." He does. Nothing. At night he removes his prickles. And when he does so, you must fling those prickles on the fire and burn them, and then the spell will be broken." "That's not it at all," she said. "That's not it." "Oh, so you do know," said the mother. "I know nothing," said the girl, frustrated and frightened and furious. And that was how she was feeling that night, where she lay in bed and he kissed her. She stayed there and she closed her eyes, and off he went. And she went over to the fir. It smelt stronger that night, and her mum's words racing around in her, an instinct telling her to trust him, but not being quite able to trust him. And so she flung his fur on the fire, and it crackled and it burnt and it scorched, and she could hear him screaming. And he didn't come back. She didn't see him come back. And she waited. She waited until she was fit to burst, and then she knew. She would just do nothing but trust her instincts now, to the deep well of a place inside that knew the answers, her own inner compass. So she went to the blacksmith, and she had made 3 pairs of iron shoes and 3 sets of iron rods, and she walked. And she walked long, and she walked tired, and she walked resolute, and she kept on walking. And there were times when she could walk no longer and she rested. But when she was ready, she got up again and she walked, and she wore through that first pair of iron shoes, and she put on the second. And she walked. She walked where her belly told her to go. She walked and she sniffed and she followed, and she walked until she'd worn out that second pair of shoes and the third pair of shoes she put on, and she flagged. She flagged for some time, but then she lifted herself up again with song and with looking up at the moon and with watching a sunrise and with drinking from clear rivers and from holding on to trees and knowing that their roots were deep, deep, deep in the ground. She kept going until she'd almost worn through a third pair of shoes. When she heard a quiet, low, sonorous sound. And she looked, and she saw her hands, her hedgehog man. And he looked, and when he saw her, he tried to run away, and she grabbed him and she said, "No, I have worn out 3 pairs of shoes and 3 sets of sticks looking for you, and I found you now, and I'm going to hold on to you." And he said, "Get away from me, get away." And she held on to him, and she held on to him, and she held on, and as she held on, his prickles fell away and fell away and fell away, until they were standing there woman and man. And now we'll see, she said. Now we'll see. And so that's how we'll leave them at the cusp of this solstice time, holding each other's hands as equals, walking towards the bright light of the sun. Thanks for listening, everybody. This has been Mooney's Mythic podcast. Thank you to Sarah Curtis. She is still on the sofa. I know I should have got her to do the Hedgehog song. Next time I'll get her to do the Hedgehog's music. Thank you. Thank you to everybody. Remember, if you want some stickers, I'm really happy to send them to you. Or if you've got some ideas about where I can stick them, let me know. And any other feedback you can give me about the podcast, about how to grow it and help it and support it to flourish, I would really, really appreciate it. But for now, I will catch up with you again next week. All the love, all the blessings. Mwah, mwah, mwah. Happy harvest to you all.